Welcome back to the second day of the 1968-2018 conference. Yesterday we were given a wonderful indigenous welcome by Carleen Thomas of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. So I'd just today like to remind people that we are on the unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people. Thank you. Turn it over to Alma, who's going to chair this session.
Good morning. My name is Alma. I am Lacan Salon Secretary, and I'm chairing today Resistances Against Dominant Psychiatric and Therapeutic Paradigms. First, we have Deidre Evans, whose the paper title is Lessons Learned from 1968, and the Need for Constant Reform. Deidre has worked in frontline community health services since starting her career in Halifax in 1971. More recently, she has been employed with Vancouver Community Mental Health Service since 1989. She taught mental health curriculum to international standard BSN nursing students at a private university in Bangladesh during annual visits from 2005 to 2011, and is currently both an international psychosocial support delegate and with the Emergency Response Unit for the Canadian Red Cross, and a safety and well-being volunteer with the BC Red Cross. Richard Ingram's title is Displacing Psychiatry and Ending Mentalism, Sanism, From Mental Patients' Liberation to the Mad Movement. Richard has been an unwaged independent scholar for the last 6 years. He divides his time between self-care for a dizzying array of diagnosed conditions, mad movement activism, and writing. He believes that his most significant contribution to academic discourse unfolded through a 2008 presentation at Syracuse University with the title Mapping Mad Studies, The Birth of an In-Discipline. In the spring of 2018, he taught a continuing education course for SFU with the title Beyond Neoliberalism, The Rise of Radical Democracy, which examined the impact of Laclau and Mouffe's radical populism on contemporary politics in Greece, Spain, and Argentina. Hilda Fernandez Alvarez, her paper title is Psychoanalysis, Critiques and Possibilities Then and Now. Hilda works as a Lacanian psychoanalyst in private practice and as a psychotherapist registered with the BC Association of Clinical Counselors for a public institution, Vancouver Coastal Health in Vancouver. She has an MA in clinical psychology, an MA in Spanish literature from UBC, and she has more than 20 years of Lacanian training. She is engaged in a PhD program in the Department of Geography at SFU, where she is conducting research on discursive spaces of trauma and the provision of services, awarded with the VCH Research Institute Team Grant. She co-founded the Lacan Salon in 2007 and currently serves as its clinical director. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A at the end.
Okay. I hope this works. Yeah, it seems okay. Let me just figure out which ways to push the button to. Yeah, good. We're good. Okay, technology always kind of eludes me, so I hope that doesn't become a distraction along the way. First of all, I want to say it's really an honor to be here, and I was asked to kind of participate because Hilda and I worked together a number of years ago, and so everything that I've seen so far has been a surprise, and I just want to say how much I enjoyed all the presentations yesterday, and the dynamism and the passion and the intelligence and the thought that kind of went into everybody's presentation yesterday. So it's really an honor to be part of it. It's also an honor to be presenting with Richard and Hilda, and really like the opportunity of having a panel where we can, within a few minutes, give diverse points of view. And so in this very complex area of mental health, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, social change, you get to hear several points of view within a short period of time. And I think that's really, it's an enjoyable thing to kind of consider working with. So my part of the presentation, I want to give an overview of, here we are in 2018, we're some years removed from the time where people with mental health issues were treated primarily in hospitals and were institutionalized. And I think in society we've moved on from that. We're using general hospitals for treatment. We have community health services. We have community mental health services. So, a lot of people have grown up without really having exposure to having people in their community who were institutionalized and taken out of their community and, kind of abandoned by the greater society. So what I want to do initially is just kind of revisit some of that and, pay some respect and honor to the people that led the movement for deinstitutionalization. And the primary one that I'm going to refer to today is Irving Goffman. And, Goffman's one of the most famous sociologists, and I hope most of you have read some of his work or, know the importance, not just in the area of institutions, but also in the other writing areas of stigma and other things that he's written about. So this small book, Asylums, was one of the forerunners to raising consciousness in the movement to move people back to their communities and take them out of the institutions. So what I've done initially is I've summarized 3 of the essays that he wrote in Asylums to see kind of what was he saying. And that's what I'm going to review briefly today. I've also prepared a longer handout so you can see some of the more complete views of what the writings are about and that kind of thing. So if people would like more information, they can refer to the longer handout. Second person that I'm going to pay some respect to is a man, Ralph Buckley, who was a social worker, was my boss at Strathcona Mental Health for a couple of years that I worked there. And Ralph just last year prepared a review of Greater Vancouver Mental Health Service that was an internationally renowned mental health service. And I'm going to look at some of the factors that were, driven by the anti-psychiatry movement. And when Greater Vancouver Mental Health was first set up in 1973-74, it really was pretty revolutionary. It was the opposite of what was happening, or people were trying to do the opposite of what was happening in the major psychiatric hospitals. So it's quite an inspiring little book that Ralph just put together last year. And the third thing I want to do in 15 minutes or less is look at what's happening in the community right now, in which we've moved into a corporate model. It seems that a lot of the reference yesterday of the frustration that people have in terms of moving social change forward as we run up against business and corporates, and money drives everything. So we're in that kind of situation with mental health services right now as well. So initially, just to look at what Goffman was saying, the other thing is Irving Goffman's wife was mentally ill, and I'm sure I didn't read a lot about her, but I'm sure she must have been institutionalized, and I think there was a subjective component to his desire to research in the institutions. So, and she died by suicide in 1964. So, we see that in that hidden side, not just with the people that were in hospitals, but also, we see family members and affected others in the community. And, maybe many of us have had lived experience or have relatives or other family members that, or friends that have had psychiatric issues. And we don't often talk about that. There's still a degree of shame and, not coming to terms with how our society really has marginalized and treated people that, aren't, in quotes, coping effectively or, have major psychiatric, like schizophrenia or major psychiatric illnesses. So Goffman certainly was one of those people as well. So what Goffman says, if you put yourself in I want to do a little subjective here. Let's say that it's you, right? And let's say that, whatever age you are, let's say that, you're in an abusive relationship and you're gradually not coping, you're breaking down over time, you start getting a little paranoid thinking, you don't trust people easily or whatever. Let's say that as a young person in your teens, you're starting to develop some kind of psychotic thought, but that's a long-term process. So gradually it's going to be kind of coming on and taking over your thinking. And then gradually in either of those circumstances, people around you notice that you're not coping so well. So let's say in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, that's happening. 1960s, that's happening. And what happens is, at a certain point, a third party, maybe the person closest to you, gets concerned. They visit a doctor, or they tell you to go and get a warrant from a magistrate because this relative needs to go to hospital. So what happens when the person goes to hospital? And what Goffman says is, truly you don't get an identity as a mental patient until you've had a hospitalization. And he also points out that many people in society suffer from the same symptoms as the people who are hospitalized, but they don't all go to hospital. And there are another number of factors that probably mean that someone will go and someone will not go. So let's say that you end up, your relatives are worried, they can't cope with your behavior, they're afraid of what's happening or whatever, you go to hospital. And then once you go into the hospital, whether you go willingly or unwillingly, you suffer the same fate. So it doesn't really matter if initially you're saying, yeah, I need help, or saying, no, there's nothing wrong with me. It doesn't matter. In that era, once you go to hospital, you suffer the same fate. And the fate that you suffer is a loss of rights in relationships. So before hospital, you have certain rights. After hospital, you don't. Before hospital, your relationships are fairly whatever they are in the community. Afterwards, not. And part of the reason not is that the person who was worried about you forms a relationship, and this is still happening. I know it from the work that I've been doing over the years. Person that is worried about you forms a relationship with the doctor, with the hospital staff, and gradually they come into the role of being your guardian. You lose the right as the person, who has charge of his or her own life. The person becomes your guardian, and they affiliate and they align with the hospital staff. Once you go into the hospital, you find that your life is structured. You're in a group of others. You're not treated as an individual. You lose access to the outside world. You're programmed. People are observing you all the time. You're constantly under surveillance. And what they're observing you for is pathology. So no matter what you do or don't do, it can diagnostic sign of illness. So you're treated as, once you've been called or labeled crazy, then you become a crazy person. Even if your behavior is rational to the circumstance that you're in, it's identified as being crazy. And so he talks in asylums about the demoralizing aspects of people being constantly under surveillance, things that you don't want to talk about. He said that people in hospital didn't talk about why they had come to a hospital, but the staff talk about it all the time, and they share it with each other. So, there's that kind of thing. People are talking about me. Well, they are talking about you, and they're talking about you in negative terms, and they're focusing kind of negatively on behavior and that kind of thing. In your group, everyone does everything together all the time. Activities are tightly scheduled, and there are formal rules. And of course, when you go in, you don't know what the formal rules are, and you kind of learn them over time, and they're not rules in your favor. They're rules. What you learn is that you have to defer to the authority of others. You have to learn what others expect from you, and you have to start behaving in certain kinds of ways in order to get into the grace of the people that are constantly setting the rules and kind of watching you for pathological kinds of behaviors and stuff. So what Goffman says is the moral career of the patient, you become a mental patient, you go in the hospital. When you come out of hospital, you have to put on a face that everyone's doing everything in quotes for your own good. And then gradually you become alienated from the whole process. Not only are you still suffering from the stress of the symptoms that you were having, but you've become alienated in the process of hospitalization. You learn that your past was a failure, and so you emerge. You go in as a person, you come out as a failure, and then you learn how to manage in society as a failure. Now, he said that people also learn to cope with that. They could put on a front of what was expected of them, and then they could kind of navigate the system. And in my mind, adaptation speaks to strength. It doesn't speak to weakness. So you see, within the framework, people are learning how to cope with it, but it is really at their detriment and at the detriment of society in general. And it could be any of us for, at any time that we're vulnerable in life, it could be really anybody that this is happening from. Essentially what Goffman says, the other thing is that you're in a situation where psychiatrists have authority, and society is an area that people are really frightened of, that they don't understand, so they give a lot of deference to the authority of the psychiatrist. And what Goffman says is that the patient sees the psychiatrist as the person in power and often has feelings of hostility to his captor as he engages in self-alienating moral servitude. So he looks at the moral issues of kind of the hospitalization. So now that's also, I would say, from my experience working with people, that's a general kind of aspect, the things I've just discussed. That's general. It doesn't talk about the extreme abuse and neglect that happened in the hospital systems. It doesn't talk about ECT, lobotomies, experimentation with drugs, heavily sedating medications, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. It doesn't talk about those things. So in the undercurrent of it, that's what we've learned when we take the lid off our institutions. We've learned that there's a very dark side. So, Goffman's talking about this kind of social side of it, not necessarily about the dark side of it. But I think if you scrape the surface, you're gonna see it. And I've seen it. I've heard it from patients over time. So I know with a certitude that those aspects also existed in hospital stays. So those were some of the conditions. And one of the things about medicines can help, medicines can overly control people, medicines can also help people get stabilized. So, one of the positive things about the medications that were developed, even chlorpromazine, which was the main one in the 50s and 60s, it supported deinstitutionalization, as did all the social changes, the stuff that we were talking about yesterday, the more humanitarian aspects of society coming to the fore and that kind of thing, supported deinstitutionalization. So let's just see how Vancouver responded. And, this is one thing I kind of got some more kind of positive, more inspiration from reading Ralph's book, because I worked in the system over some of those years, and I was inspired at the time, and it kind of re-inspired me. So let's just see what happened in Vancouver in response to the institutions. So what happened was the NDP under Dave Barrett came into power in 1972, right on. And so what happened is the NDP asked a couple of psychiatrists to do some studies, because people were being deinstitutionalized from Riverview and were kind of coming into the streets, were kind of flooding general hospitals, didn't have proper care, etc. So the NDP commissioned 2 studies, and the first one was with psychiatrist Richard Folks. And in his report, he described Riverview as a barbaric, antiquated institution which needed to be destroyed as quickly as possible. So he was a little over the edge for what they wanted in a report. So although he submitted the report, they kind of didn't ask him to go further. And so then they commissioned Cummings did a good job. Dr. John Cummings was also of the same mind, but he also was more of a planner. And so John Cummings developed a humanistic plan for follow-up in the community. And what that plan led to was they called them care teams, community care teams. They were called in the 1970s. And what he said is that services need to be integrated under one umbrella, but they needed to be decentralized. Like, he advocated for an organic process. Go to the community, bond with the clients, focus on the needs of the most fragile clients, and see what you could kind of come up with. And he gave some guidelines, like he wanted mental health workers to be advocates and friends of the clients. Therapy was to focus on survival skills and supportive relationships, not on pathologizing people and, making them feel bad and alienating them from the world. Attendance at the teams was voluntary. That was the other thing. And in order to get people to come to the teams, we needed to be in there supporting them so they felt that it was the right place for them to be. He wanted the most help us. Like in the States, it was deinstitutionalization. The community services turned to what we used to call the worried well, like family, counseling and, sophisticated therapies and all this kind of thing. In Canada and in Vancouver, we focused on the people that were deinstitutionalized from hospital. And the advertising in the brochures at that time the brochures said, we offer supportive care and medication programs to avoid unnecessary admission to psychiatric hospitals. It didn't focus on if you're a mental patient or if you have schizophrenia, come and see us. It focused on, we're here to keep you out of hospital, whatever the conditions were that led you to be there in the first place. Services also, Cummings said, were to evolve naturally, not to be chained to rules and policies of a large bureaucracy. Now, since then, in the current model, we are chained to the rules and policies of a large bureaucracy. But at the time, in the community level, that wasn't, for a number of years, that didn't happen. And what they did use at the teams was they had community boards constituted that hired the staff. And I remember at Strathcona, when the people I worked with had not been hired on his first interview because he wore a suit to the interview, right? So he had to try a few more times before he got into the teams. Greater Vancouver Community Mental Health Services had its own board of governance. So it was an NGO that was autonomous and independent, although the funding came from the provincial government. Medications were provided for free, and they still are for people that don't have means to afford them for psychiatric issues. So that's generally, there was a kind of the social movement really translated into developing skills in compassion, ability to relate to people, networking and services. I remember at the time, like there were a lot of meetings locally, you'd get out and about, you'd meet the other people in the system. There was a general spirit of really wanting to kind of help people and use the psychiatric knowledge as part of an understanding of the person, but not overwhelm yourself or the person's relatives, with labels and diagnoses and, projections of fear and helplessness and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of the model. And I think for a good 10 or 12 years, it was an effective model. And then what happened, of course, is, the constant change in society is that we move past the knowledge that people were in hospital, like I was saying when I started, like past, what it really meant to be in hospital. And the other thing is that psychiatry started changing and focusing more on neurobiology, and that's been a constant kind of change in our delivery of services. So it's become a medical model, but not a psychiatric-driven model, because now it's a bureaucracy, it's a corporate-driven model. And the last part of this presentation is just to kind of, I found another paper that okay, good, 2 minutes is good. I found another paper that I listed in that write-up that talks about different models of doing community mental health service, and the one that we have is the corporate structure model. So corporate structural model has a centralized bureaucracy with CEOs and heads of departments. In fact, if you look up the budget for 2018 for Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, you see that the cost of the corporate structure is the same as the amount of money that goes into community mental health. So, and this wasn't true initially when it was set up in 2001, but that's kind of evolved over time. The bureaucracy takes over. Mental health is now part of all health. So, and also the hospitals have come into the system. So once again, we're in, most of the money in the budget goes to hospital care. So we're in a system now with our community services, in which hospital admissions are dominating the way that we do treatment in the community. So, and the idea is that we're supposed to keep people out of hospital and that people get less and less care in hospital, et cetera, et cetera. And the authority and the power really is within the hospital system. Even though there's a cooperation that goes on with that, we still know where the power is or where the authority lies. So just to kind of say what some current issues are in mental health is the caseload. We haven't had significant increases in budgets except to build buildings, which is kind of cool, nice to have good facilities, et cetera. But we haven't had at the community level increases in budgets for many years in order to get more workers or more people doing, carrying clients. Worker average is 70 clients per person. How do you form friendship or, advocacy relations with 70 people? How do you get to know their family? How do you get to know the other services that they work with, et cetera, et cetera? We've got an influx. Our mandate has opened. We're not just focused on the fragile mentally ill population. Almost anyone with mental health issues, if they're in an extreme state, can get a referral to the mental health team. So there's a lot of competition. And people with extreme behavioral problems and addiction issues, we have an addiction component at the team, but we've got addiction issues with our mental health clients as well, which is, a complicating factor. So addiction issues and then behavioral aspects, et cetera, put a lot of strain on workers' time. And, we're also not, we used to, in GVMHS, we had regular education sessions every couple of weeks. That doesn't happen anymore. There's educational training. It's mostly cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not on, how to work well in the world or general coping skills or whatever. So that's another lack is kind of in the availability of education opportunities to workers in the system. There's also a program, and I'll just end with this. There's a program called Extended Leave, and I'm sure most of you are not familiar with that. So extended leave is basically outpatient committal, and it means that hospitals can arrange with the community mental health teams for a person who is non-compliant in their eyes to be put on a compulsory requirement that they attend treatment at the team and take the medicines that the team prescribes for them, that they attend appointments, take the medicines, sometimes live in a certain facility or whatever. So, and as what I've noticed, because I've been in the system since before extended leave was in, what I've noticed is as the worker caseloads get higher and higher, then we get more people on extended leave because the most difficult, like the most resistant clients will be put on extended leave because they're not happy with the way, being in the system the way they're being treated, and we don't have time to do the bridging relationships in the way that we used to do it. So extended leave, I've known from the start, people have said that we need to test it as a human rights issue, but so far as I know, we haven't had a major issue go to the Supreme Court in terms of extended leave, so maybe that will come up at some time in terms of human rights of people with psychiatric problems. And then the other thing is the focus now is on medicines, and fortunately we have a lot of medicines available, but medicines, coming in to see the doctor to prescribe medicine is a very short-term thing, and it accommodates the fact that you don't have a lot of time for your clients. So, we'll need a lot more kind of focus on the needs of the clients, I think, in addition to use of medications, and a lot more connecting with what the client wants in that area and doing more education, et cetera. So anyway, that's where I'll end it, hopefully having given you a bit of an overview over time of the complexities of the mental health system. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to, first of all, check this microphone. If anyone needs me to speak louder, then please put your hand up. My voice does trail off sometimes, so you may need that reminder. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel, Hilda, and thank you to the organizers of this conference. I have to apologize that I was not able to be here yesterday. I was really not very well at all, and also there's one other factor that I'll explain later on. Okay, so my title is Displacing Psychiatry and Ending Mentalism or Sanism from Mental Patients' Liberation to the Mad Movement. And I'm also doing an overview. I'm not setting out an argument. I'm just putting forth points which I hope can open up to a discussion. You know, when I was thinking about this delivering this paper, I remembered the UK Conservative Party conference and Theresa May, a leader who's not particularly popular at the moment, coming on stage to the song "Dancing Queen," and I was trying to think which ABBA song would I like to accompany her to come on. And it would probably be Take a Chance on Me. 10 years ago, there was a conference here on madness and citizenship, and organised by Robert Menzies, an excellent conference that foregrounded the work of a lot of mad activists. I gave a paper as part of that conference in this very room, and I was at the time really hearing voices, experiencing visions a lot, to the extent that I remember nothing of that paper, absolutely nothing. I think there are times where it's important for people who experience voices and visions to be given the opportunity to speak at conferences. Hopefully I said something useful that day. I'm not in that kind of state today, that alternative state of consciousness. I just want to say that at the beginning. But that's why I say take a chance on me. Thank you for taking a chance on me. In the course summary that concludes his 1973 to 74 lectures on psychiatric power at the Collège de France, Michel Foucault posits that the crisis becomes apparent and the still barely delineated age of anti-psychiatry begins with the suspicion and soon after the certainty that Charcot actually produced the historical fit he described. So, anti-psychiatry for Foucault is seen not as a movement that began in the 1960s, but rather one that dates back to the 1870s. Furthermore, for Foucault, anti-psychiatry is a rebellion internal to the discipline of psychiatry. His hypothesis is that, quote, the whole of psychiatry, the whole of modern psychiatry is permeated by anti-psychiatry, if by that we understand everything that calls into question the role of the psychiatrist previously given responsibility for producing the truth of illness within the hospital space. On the one hand, then, the discipline of psychiatry assumes that the psychiatrist is a neutral subject whose knowledge is used to identify symptoms deemed to be apparent in the behaviours exhibited by the objects of their gaze. On the other hand, there have been multiple anti-psychiatries, with the common thread being an emphasis on the role of power relations in producing truth, and therefore on revealing the ways in which psychiatry is a political practice. Although Foucault presents a compelling case for the idea that the concerns of anti-psychiatry have accompanied psychiatry since its formation as a discipline, it's important to note that the concept of anti-psychiatry wasn't introduced until 1967. So it was introduced by David Cooper at a now legendary event, the Congress on the Dialectics of Liberation, which took place in London in the second part of July 1967. Other speakers at this event included R.D. Laing, Gregory Bateson, Stokely Carmichael, and Herbert Marcuse. And here I'll just insert, in mentioning this year, 1967, that it's natural for me to think of this time frame of 1968 to the present because I was born in 1967. In preparing for this presentation, the first text to which I turned was Julian Borg's From Revolution to Ethics, May 1968, and the contemporary French thought. Borg characterizes anti-psychiatry as, quote, an international radical tendency generally inclined toward viewing madness as socially constructed. It brought the spirit of anti-authoritarian revolt to the mentally ill and their caregivers. The first part of this definition is consistent with Foucault's perspective that anti-psychiatry focuses on mental illness as a phenomenon that is not a given, but rather something that has to be produced. The second part of the definition, though, points out that in the late 60s and early 70s, anti-psychiatry was more than a rebellion internal to the discipline of psychiatry. During these years, many people swept up by the revolutionary spirit of the times came to believe it was their responsibility to challenge psychiatric power. The rebellion therefore extended well beyond the leading figures within the psychiatric profession, notably R.D. Laing, David Cooper, Thomas Zass, and Franco Basaglia. 51 years after Cooper introduced the term anti-psychiatry, there is little understanding among most self-described radicals of the extent to which psychiatric power has reinforced its position within the state and extended its domain throughout civil society. The idea that leftists have a responsibility to challenge psychiatric power has largely vanished. Dissidents within contemporary psychiatry, such as Peter Breggin, are both rare and highly marginalized within their discipline, and their works are not read as contributions to broader counter-hegemonic struggles. All of which leads to the question, did the rebellion against psychiatry fizzle out, and should I wrap up my talk here? If we follow the path traced by Julian Borg, then we might conclude that the answer is yes. In the section of From Revolution to Ethics, devoted to anti-psychiatry, his primary concern appears to be what we might term the theoretical dividend of madness. In particular, Borg examines the impact of the first volume of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia, the remarkable Anti-Oedipus. The three-page chapter that... What was the last thing you said? Schizophrenia and what? Right, yeah, the first, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari wrote a two-volume study, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. The first volume was Anti-Oedipus. The second volume was 1,000 Plateaus. So this Julian Borg book is just focusing on the first one, Anti-Oedipus. The three-page chapter that concludes his consideration of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy of desire bears the title, Craziness is a Dead End. As a psychiatric survivor, it is hard to convey the level of repulsion that I felt when I read this chapter. If madness and craziness are no more than resources to be mined by philosophy, then perhaps they are indeed dead ends in the sense of finite resources. However, Borg's book appeared in print 10 years after the publication of a memoir that reclaimed the words mad and crazy by somebody who I'm proud to call my friend, Irit Shimrat. The memoir is Call Me Crazy, Stories from the Mad Movement, which was published in 1997. Although Borg does mention in passing Sherry Turkle's focus on what she refers to as grassroots anti-psychiatry, Borg seems to think that the latter reached its zenith in 1975. So to return briefly to Félix Guattari, in a 1972 interview to publicize the book Anti-Oedipus, Vittorio Marchetti asked the authors, could psychiatry take on the role as the new human science, the human science par excellence? The reply given by Guattari was, much to his credit, I think, rather than psychiatry, why not the schizophrenics, the mad people themselves? I don't believe that those who work in the field of psychiatry, at least at this moment, are really the ones in the avant-garde. So 1972, he said that. In the fall of 1997, I had just begun my PhD in interdisciplinary studies at UBC, and I was struggling to come to terms with the diagnosis of schizophrenia that I'd been given the previous year. Along with Irit Shimrat's book, this quote helped give me some desperately needed confidence. In July 2001, psychiatric survivor activists from around the world converged on Vancouver to demonstrate outside and participate in the Congress of the World Federation for Mental Health, which took place at the Convention Centre. Preceding the conference, an organisation called the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry was formally established, and it held its first General Assembly. The person elected to chair the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry was Judy Chamberlain, author of the definitive text of the Mental Patients Liberation Movement on Our Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. And Judy Chamberlain was here in Vancouver at the time of the Vancouver Mental Patients Association, which set up a house, a refuge house, and helped model some of the services that Vancouver Coastal Health then replicated. In part, I'm mentioning these events for personal reasons. The demonstration, the 2001 demonstration, was organised by another key organisation on the psychiatric survivor landscape, Mind Freedom International, whose objective has been to bring about a non-violent revolution in mental health. There were many leaders of our movement at this demonstration who I heard for the first time, including Judy Chamberlain, David Oakes of Mind Freedom International, Gisela Sartori of UConn's Second Opinion Society, Leonard Roy Frank, and Irit Shimrat of the Lower Mainland's West Coast Mental Health Network. And this organisation, the West Coast Mental Health Network, has its AGM this afternoon. This organisation is the last remaining organisation that's run by and for people who've gone through mental health services.
We had all our funding cut in 2003,
Yeah.
or 13, so we've been operating on fumes.
So that's the other reason why I wasn't here yesterday, is preparing for that AGM. Okay, so the other reason for picking this historical moment is that it's intended as a snapshot to gesture towards the complexity and diversity of the psychiatric survivor movement. So at this point, I'm going to resort to a word popularized by Wikipedia, disambiguation. In an attempt to clarify what the main objective of my presentation has been, in the Wikipedia entry on anti-psychiatry, there is no disambiguation of this term, even though it is in practice used to refer to distinct movements and bodies of ideas. In what is probably her most celebrated essay, The Ex-Patients Movement, Where We've Been and Where We're Going, Judy Chamberlain asserts that although there is a degree of overlap, the anti-psychiatry and the mental patients liberation movement are distinct. Although the terms have often been used interchangeably, mental patients liberation, or psychiatric inmates liberation, and anti-psychiatry are not the same thing. Anti-psychiatry is largely an intellectual exercise for academics and dissident mental health professionals. And this is the crucial thing. There has been little attempt within anti-psychiatry to reach out to struggling ex-patients or include their perspective. So like Foucault, psychiatric survivors tend to view anti-psychiatry as a rebellion internal to a discipline that perpetuates our oppression. And like Guattari, we believe that it is psychiatric survivors whose movement is more relevant than psychiatry and anti-psychiatry. I'm going to end by referring to one of the crucial advances of the psychiatric survivor movement, which is to name the form of oppression to which we are subjected. And there is some discussion about whether the better term here is mentalism or sanism, and that's why both are in my title. But the one that was promoted by Judy Chamberlain was mentalism. So the problem was that non-patients, missed out a sentence. In the 1970s, there was a lot of discussion of whether to allow mental health professionals and other potential allies to join organizations of ex-patients. The problem was that non-patients were often seen as holding prejudiced beliefs, and indeed, many of these beliefs had been internalized by ex-patients. As Chamberlain recalls, group members began to recognize a pattern they referred to as mentalism and sane chauvinism, a set of assumptions which most people seemed to hold about mental patients. That they were incompetent, unable to do things for themselves, constantly in need of supervision and assistance, unpredictable, likely to be violent or irrational, and so forth. Not only did the general public express mentalist ideas, so did ex-patients themselves. The struggle against internalized oppression and mentalism was seen as best accomplished in groups composed exclusively of patients through the process of consciousness raising. 48 years on from the establishment of the first mental patients liberation organization, it has become increasingly apparent just how entrenched the ideology of mentalism is. Instead of signaling that psychiatry was in retreat, deinstitutionalization paved the way for more comprehensive systems of control. And I was going to add one other quote, but I think for reasons of time I should stop there.
Thank you.
So shall we go until the 11:30? So I'm gonna try to.
Don't worry about finishing
No.
at 11:30. We can. Some genius has organized the timing so that
We have a little.
there's plenty of wiggle room.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I want to thank Ian for the invitation to organize this panel that allows me to be in this warm company of friends and colleagues that I really appreciate very much your presence here. 1968 was a climax of antinomian agitation that targeted French institutions. The revolutionary reflects notably in the sphere of the mental institution and its practice. As Borg indicates, quote, the immediate post-1968 period rejected both straitjackets and palliatives, unquote. In the France of the 60s, a bustling theoretical activity emerges from existentialism, Sartre, phenomenology, the followers of Merleau-Ponty, Freudian psychoanalysis with Marxist lenses, influences by Reich and Marcuse from the Frankfurt School, and prominently the structuralist turn commanded by Lévi-Strauss, Foucault, Barthes, and Lacan. This fecund milieu caused a number of initiatives which target dominant paradigms of psychiatry and psychotherapy. This version of anti-psychiatry, different from their British counterparts who take psychiatry's concerns as primarily socially construed and reject the notion of diagnosis, was significantly influenced by psychoanalysis, particularly the one being developed by the influential French analyst Jacques Lacan. One of these amazing experiments was the institutional psychotherapy, a project still alive and that firstly began in the early 50s in the Saint-Alban clinic, where Frantz Fanon and Jean Horry received their training. This clinic of the post-war incorporated a Marxist spirit with the intention of approaching the unconscious exchanges within the institution. An extension of Saint-Alban is La Borde Clinic that ran from 1953 until 1974, led by Jean Horry and Félix Guattari. In this, it still runs, but it ran until the 74 in this format. Guattari was a psychiatrist who attended Lacan's seminars and conducted an analysis with him for a few years. Alongside Deleuze, you know well, they launched an important critique contra the institution of psychoanalysis, which I will elaborate briefly. Labor Clinic envisions the psychiatric institution as a center of emancipation and liberation, committed to equality among all the participants and anti-segregation and de-alienation of the mentally ill. This astonishing project lacked material means, which, as is often the case, was supplemented with a determined desire, showing the possibilities and limits of an institution in constant scrutiny of their unconscious interactions. The Laborian project incorporated ethnography, Marxism, structuralism, Freudian psychoanalysis, and key Lacanian concepts to guide the running of the place and the relationships involved in providing services for the mentally ill. Quasi-utopian. 3 periods are mentioned by Berg according to the publications by the Centre d'Etudes, the Research, and the Formation Institutionnelle, and includes a first period between 1953 to 1959, which consisted in, quote, a structure known as the grill, based on a rotation of tasks and a blurring of work identities, unquote. Doctors had to clean, and cleaning staff had to provide care for patients in a rotating grid. There were a number of assemblies and committees where everybody could express their thoughts, fantasies, and desires. This egalitarian radicality didn't last, of course, as Borg points out, because efforts to reshape social relationships, roles, and tasks to de-alienate people, they brought about other forms of alienation. So the second period shifted the focus between 1959 and 1964 to the unconscious relationships within the institution, which utilizes the Lacanian concept of empty speech, parole vide. Empty speech refers to the quotidian blah, blah, blah of the speaking being, running away from full speech, which is the word readily opened by the unconscious truth. The clinic runs through group discussions to address, through the empty speech, to address, quote, resistances and alienation whose sources were understood to be more deeply libidinal than ego attachments to task and status, unquote. To be able to deal with the limits of the sayable, not only the impossible of signification, but also the limits of what can be discussed in public when you involve the erotic of a group, they brought about the creation of the local law, which Borg refers to the non-totality of the institutional field. Now, fast forward 50 years later and move geographies to Vancouver currently, or any city in North America. We do not only lack the audacity of hope, to paraphrase the title of our first talk yesterday, but we are entrenched in a system that no matter how well-intended individuals are, how diversely trained and passionate about their jobs workers are, the system relies in the replication of a neoliberal capitalist model. The managerial model of business enterprise have been shaping all institutions for the past 50 years, university, school, judicial systems. Pertaining to the mental health institution, we observe the impact of an obsessionality with measurement, manualized therapies, rigidity of protocols, and the hegemony of the so-called evidence-based treatments. These evidence-based treatments hold a scientific status and are the dominant form of therapy deployed in public mental health all around the world. Based on research that uses randomized clinical trials as the highest standard, these therapies are granted superiority over other types of interventions as self-proclaimed highly effective. 2 of those dominant therapies are the cognitive behavioral therapy, prescribed for depression and anxiety, and the dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. These evidence-based treatments are based on interventions that target the ego and presupposes that A, the mental health issue are pathological or maladaptive. B, assume that the issues are consciously transparent to both the suffering individual and the therapist. 3, that the solution consists in the implementation of formulaic approaches that target cognition and behavior. And D, the interventions are a matter of skill training. These assumptions are problematic, as in the human mind and its symptoms, there's always something more than just conscious ego. And there is a significant limit when we focus only in a solution. So there's little possibility of redemption in terms of the history, the meaning, etc., of the individual in suffering. The majority of services are psychiatric-based medication and case management, and therapies are very short, addressing mainly strategies to cope with the affect rather than processing histories, identities, or meaning. Bustow calls this the pharmacological reason over medication and use of drugs as preferred and foremost treatment. And Mills call it McDonaldization of people's health, the same recipe of services to all, a very slim possibility of historical redemption, I just said, a prescriptive set of coping tools that are a band-aid and leave individuals often feeling more guilty because they should be feeling better by now. These modalities exert domination. It has impacts in people's well-being and prevents the incorporation of the case-by-case golden rule of singularity that any self-respecting psychotherapeutic treatment needs to observe as an ethical imperative to honor the complexity of the human subject. Thankfully, however, there's a spirit of hope in the health authority as they are trying to fund research from the clinician and from the same patients, a grassroots type of approach, rather than coming from academics that rarely has worked within the field. I'm the recipient of a fund that is allowing me to conduct my PhD research, which is an institutional critique about the discourses of trauma and healing in the mental health institution. This research mixes qualitative methodology that includes ethnography, participant observation, and discourse analysis of interviews and focus groups with patients, therapists, managers, and I am also including ethics review to build my case. Mine is a critical theoretical position against dominant theories of counseling provision to affect its practice in Vancouver and looks at the intersection of the individual, the singular experience, and the social, the institutional practice, focusing on addressing the unconscious. Now, how are we at the time? Like 5 minutes? Sure. Yeah. Now, is psychoanalysis a possible solution? Before answering this question, I wanted to talk about anti-Oedipus, but probably I'm just gonna skip the whole anti-Oedipus and go to the main questions. That, yeah, I was kind of braiding them together, but anti-Oedipus is usually, I'm gonna try to briefly just say it. Anti-Oedipus is considered a critique of psychoanalysis. I don't see it as a critique of psychoanalysis. I see it as a critique of the institution of psychoanalysis. And it's not so much that he's making a problem with Lacan. They take a lot of the principles of Lacan. For example, the Lacanian psychoanalysis. They are criticizing the gray and the coagulation of the system of how it is delivered. And it's a radical critique for sure. So what psychoanalysis, as is the case in countless places in the world, is indeed a possibility to think the institution as a site of critique. The critique of the institution of university or the critique of the oppressive nature of anti-oppression movements, the critique of marriage and monogamy, etc. Any critique, the subject in its immediate social self, requires a certain disposition to include oneself in the critique, to admit the subjective division between what I say and the truth that inhabits me, which elicits an almost natural resistance to psychoanalysis for the fear we naturally have of our own unconscious. If we have never articulated anything about it, we are so afraid. An automatic dismissal that prevents the recognition of something else that exists outside of our narcissistic whole idea of consciousness. What world would be possible if we could go about like a huge lab clinic experience? However precarious could we be able to stand ethically on the truth of our own unconscious productions with others? Yesterday, Ian posed a question about the transcendental universality of the human, a question he asked me when I presented a talk, So Do You Want a Master was the talk, which is becoming a book chapter. I argue that it is the unconscious and its difficult apprehension that will correspond to the universal, to that we share with the rest of human beings. Quote, those instances of the traumatic residue, its insistence as an exclusion outside of signification, and which cause a great deal of strife in peoples and communities, that lack that we struggle to articulate and acknowledge, unquote, that is the universal. If we understood it as the singular universal, would we be able to rely on the ethical inquiry of the unconscious to link thought and action? That's the ongoing, parentheses, possible challenge we all face.